Hi, thanks for watching. Okay, so in this video, I'd like to talk a little bit about something very important in narcissism and NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, and I think also even in just cluster B in general, just like borderline, antisocial. And basically, this is something that I think is really shows up in just all the cluster B disorders, which is kind of a barrier. Okay, how people who have these cluster B disorders, especially the narcissistic, but also the others. Um, how people have sort of like a barrier. People who are narcissistic basically have sort of a barrier that sort of prevents them from fully taking in and fully engaging with the realities outside of their, let's say, their inner circle. Okay, not necessarily just themselves. I've seen narcissistic people who have an inner circle that includes some other people. Okay, but basically to the broader outside world, to the broader environment, there's sort of a barrier that prevents sort of like full taking in of considerations, content, concerns, alternative points of view, alternative realities, the realities of other people. Basically, there's sort of a barrier that prevents a lot of material coming in. Okay, or something else that happens a lot with narcissistic people, taking in information that is in conflict with their preferred beliefs. Okay, so if I have a preferred way of looking at the world, when I see things that are potentially in conflict that could really bother me, okay, I have trouble sort of taking that in. Okay, and then there's another thing too. When a person has cluster B, okay, when you're very stimulated by something, when you really like something, okay, you get so excited by what you like, okay, that it sort of creates a barrier. Just how much you love something, the frenzy of something that you're really fascinated with, that frenzy sort of creates like a wall, like another barrier that prevents other information from coming in. Okay, and that can be very dangerous. Okay, because that can involve sort of like a diminished sobriety. Basically, imagine the classic case. A man is very attracted to a woman, or let's say a woman is very attracted to a man, and they're so caught up in how attracted they feel that they start to get so consumed with all their excitement that they put up like almost like a barrier, and now they can't take in other environmental considerations, like, hey, maybe I'm being too pushy, maybe I'm being too eager, maybe I should be like more subtle, and then they can come across like too intense and too aggressive. You know what I mean? Or in the worst case, they can actually violate the rights of that person, or abuse them. So you can see how um, whatever ends up causing these barriers, okay, where you're not taking in all the environmental information, you're just taking in certain selective information from the environment. Okay, I'd like to talk a little bit more about that barrier and why actually, even though I try to be optimistic, I want to be optimistic. I want to think that I can get better as a person who myself has been diagnosed with cluster B disorder. And I want to think that people in general, can get better just by opening themselves, But the problem is as we look at the barrier that keeps us from opening ourselves, let's say, to a broader information. Okay, it may be that barrier has a lot of psychic turbulence, a lot of psychic violence. There may be actually psychic violence in that barrier, like viciousness, like a lot of intensity. And that in a sense we're almost dealing with like taming a wild animal, because that vicious intensity that's in the barrier itself, okay, that psychic intensity might not be so easy to just dissolve and just to calm down. It might require a lot of serious struggle, a lot of serious work to even just bring the intensity of the wall down, so that barrier sort of dissolves a little bit. Okay, so it's not just so simple as, oh, I just want to open myself to the rest of the world and just welcome everything in. You may want to welcome everything in, but the barrier itself may have sort of a life of its own, and it may be very, very delicate and very tricky, and maybe even impossible in some cases, to really eliminate the barrier. Okay, and also, like, I don't want to forget or overlook the fact that the actual, like any force field, whenever you create a force field or a wall, it has to be made of something. Okay, and I'm afraid that maybe the actual material of the wall, let's say the barrier psychologically that gets put up, to sort of like select information that comes into someone with cluster B, I'm afraid that maybe the actual substance of the wall might psychologically be made of, let's say, psychic viciousness. psychic rage, violence, psychic violence. Basically, it's sort of like psychologically, the material of the barrier may actually be sort of like a kind of a mental violence or a mental viciousness, and so now we're looking at a situation where a person has like natural barrier structures, okay, but that the actual substance of those barriers is actually a psychological state of actual viciousness or violence. Okay, so that there already is a very problematic arousal inside the psychology of a person with cluster B, where that the arousal is actually building walls. You know what I mean? But that arousal is problematic because we're already sort of brewing with sort of a lot more hostility and a lot more viciousness than we're aware of. Okay, because a lot of this happens outside of our awareness because it's not really integrated. You know what I mean? So basically, while I want to be optimistic and I want to encourage, let's say hopefulness and belief that it is possible to get better, at the very same time, we ought to be very realistic that it may be very, very insidious and very difficult, okay, to actually approach all the little elements, the psychological elements that would be involved in, let's say, dissolving these walls. And it may not be as trivial or as easy as we might think. And we may have to live with the fact that there's a lot of viciousness inside of us that is not really integrated. It's sort of outside of our conscious control, but that we may have to approach the task over the years and years, of trying to recover from these disorders, to really deal with how do we, let's say, calm down these like vicious force fields, basically, and how, is there a way to sort of dissolve or sort of mitigate or sort of lower the intensity, because otherwise we're carrying a kind of violence in us, sort of a viciousness in us. You know what I mean? At least I'm open to that possibility, because I think we have to exhaust all the possibilities. Okay, you can't just have a force field or, let's say, a barrier made of nothing. It's not just made of plastic, it's made of some psychic substance. Okay, and I think the psychic substance is probably pretty intense and probably not far from rage or from violence or from viciousness. So, these are things that we may not be fully responsible for it, because it's kind of, we're sort of born with these qualities, and maybe we don't really have full control, but we are accountable. We're accountable for them. And just like a person who's an addict, they didn't choose to be an addict. They don't control the fact that they have an addictive personality, but we're all accountable for these conditions, even if it's unfair that we have them. We are accountable. And the actual the process of actually dealing with these things and maybe working with these things may be much more difficult than what we think. Okay, and it may be that just having a therapist once a week, it may turn out that may not be enough. Maybe in an ideal world, there might be, like, say, sponsors or mentors that we could check in with, like, on a pretty regular basis, or just have a much more scrupulous habit of sort of checking in with ourselves and really watching ourselves in life, because we may start getting better for a while, but then it may be very easy to slip back into these barriers. You know what I mean? So basically, I just want to try to talk about how I think the barriers of cluster B are actually constituted with emotional material, basically. And so I want to try to kind of contrast the difference between barrier emotions, emotions that sort of function as barriers, and emotions that are actually processed deep in our, let's say, our gut. I say our gut, I say that poetically, right? But there's a difference between emotions that serve as barriers and emotions that are indicating the process of taking in reality, not having a barrier, and taking in reality and processing it through our, let's say, gut level processing. Okay, so I don't want to encourage people, and I don't want to believe that all emotions are the same. Okay, I think some emotions can be obstructive. Okay, because they're almost like emotional walls. Like, hey, I don't want information coming in. So it's an emotional state, but it's an emotional state where it's sort of like, it's almost like creating it's like creating a barrier to not let real information come into our guts. So it's almost like it's almost like similar to someone who has a phobia, like, oh, I don't want to get close to a spider, so you never get to touch the real feelings around spiders because it's like, I don't want to get close to it. It's like emotionally you're putting up that wall, you know what I mean? And I think the same thing might be coming up with cluster B and narcissism and all that. And so let me just try to talk about some of my own experiences to make this less abstract. Okay. So, like, say, in my experience, I had the unfortunate experience as a young person that I got into aviation. Okay. I was actually a pilot. Okay. And that's a very problematic thing for me because that was really part of my narcissism. Okay. Which is I had so much of my self-esteem sort of invested in the idea of what it meant to be a pilot, because a pilot in a way is kind of a superhuman person. Okay. Because you have to have a superhuman level of attention, responsibility, control. You have to basically manage a very complex vehicle in a complex situation where you could die, where it's very dangerous. If anything really goes wrong, you and other people could get killed, especially if you're carrying passengers or if you're flying over a populated area. So a lot could go wrong, and there's a lot in your hands. So it does sort of create the idea of like a superhuman person, and you sort of become invested in becoming like this very special person who can do very extraordinary things in the face of danger. And then also there's a lot of mathematics and geometry involved in navigation. So in a way, I think we really underestimate how sophisticated it is to be a pilot, because you have to really almost be a master of, like, say, trigonometry and mixed with meteorology, with the weather, and just you mix navigation and then the aircraft systems. You're blending so much information. I really think being a pilot is almost on the level of being like an engineer, and in fact I think it might even be more sophisticated than being an engineer, because there's so much real-time responsibility involved in handling an aircraft. Okay, so basically, unfortunately, because I had issues, psychological issues, okay, it was probably not very good for me to get so, I guess, so invested in the fantasy of being a pilot, but I actually became a pilot, okay, for a while. And inevitably, because of my immaturity and my behavior problems, eventually I had trouble getting along with other pilots. I had trouble getting along with my employer, who I was working as a pilot, okay, and I ended up losing that career. Okay, and that really, really hurt. It really hurt because I could see that I had problems, and I could see that I didn't match the, let's say, the fantasy of being such a superhuman, such a wonderful, what it would mean to be a pilot, and that hurts so bad. Okay, but the thing is I think in a way it hurts so bad, okay, that I never got to process the reality of my life. Okay, in a way that it was so painful that the pain of, let's say, not being able to be a pilot, okay, and realizing that I had, let's say, a lot of personal problems, okay, that pain actually formed a barrier, okay, that actually prevented all that reality from digesting and hitting me in the gut and having a gut level process, so I could just move on in an integrated way and not be stuck in just being in pain about it. Okay. And the same thing happens, let's say, in my personal experience, when I've been, let's say, attracted to women when I was younger. Okay. Nowadays, I don't have so much of a problem with that. But when I was much younger, I'd be really attracted, let's say, to someone, and I would be so attracted that it's kind of like the pain of not being able to be a pilot. It's like I'd get so attracted that I'd just be like full of all these feelings, like, say, of being attracted, that it would actually form a barrier. So I couldn't take in other common sense information, like, hey, am I really a good match for that person? Does that person really understand me, or do we even have a friendship, or, like, you know what I mean? Like, so I couldn't I couldn't approach those feelings and process them so I could actually behave in a responsible way. And so sometimes I would be like kind of insensitive, and I'd sort of like hit on a person without taking into account maybe that they don't want somebody to express attraction, or maybe I wasn't like a good fit for them. So there was a lot of other considerations I wasn't taking in, because I'd be so full of all that attraction that it prevented other information from coming in. So in a sense, like, these really big emotional states, they were actually acting as barriers, and I wasn't actually processing the emotions. Okay, so we really need to distinguish, I think, between sort of like barrier emotions, emotions that function as barriers, and actual gut level processing of emotion. Okay. So just because you're having an emotional state, just because you're in pain, just because you feel terrible about something, that doesn't mean you're processing it at a gut level. So we really ought to distinguish those emotions, because if we're not really open and processing really the full content of our environment through our guts at a gut level processing, I think we are in that state where we're sort of putting barriers and we're just selecting information that comes in, and we're not really advancing and integrating. And I think that is kind of a narcissistic position. Okay. So basically, it just occurred to me, as I've sometimes I think back of my past, and I think back on how I lost a couple of careers. I also lost a career as a lawyer because I had trouble getting along with people. Okay. And I had trouble because of my immaturity. So basically, when I think of the pain of losing careers, and realizing that I'm a person that has problems and I'm not successful and I'm a loser, etc. When I think of that pain, okay, I have to be honest and think that in that pain that forms that wall, that like barrier that actually prevents processing, okay, I think the actual psychic sort of material, the substance of that wall is not just pain. I think there is a lot of viciousness. I think there is a lot of rage, and I think a lot of almost like psychic violence, because it actually forms a barrier. Like, don't let this stuff in. You know what I mean? And so it's not just that I'm upset that I couldn't be a pilot. It's not just that I get so attracted to a woman or whatever, but it's almost like in addition, I'm actually putting up like my hands, like, don't let other information in. You know what I mean? And there's something psychologically, and I think it's very vicious. I think there's actually vicious, psychic viciousness that forms the actual force field to actually, prevent other information from coming in. Okay. And so, like, say, even in the case of being attracted to a woman, getting so attracted, I don't realize there are some flames coming in. Okay. There are flames coming in the attraction, where I think the content of the flames is actually a lot of rage, viciousness, violence, whatever. And that helps form the barrier. So I don't have to take in the other competing information like, hey, maybe I should take it easy. Maybe this isn't the right time. Maybe I should be friends first. Maybe I should even see if it's even possible to be friends. Or maybe, hey, sometimes it's wise just to pass, just to let yourself be attracted and just not. But I don't take in all that information because it's like I put this force field. Okay. And I think we really should examine the psychology of that emotional force field. Okay. And that is sort of like in the family, I think of barrier emotions. Okay. As opposed to the emotions that come in and get processed at the gut level. So obviously, a healthier person, if they're attracted to somebody, okay, they actually are able to take that in at the gut level along with other information, okay, about the circumstances. Okay. Whether really it's a good idea to even try to communicate with that person, whether I should even try to be friends with that person, and just take in all the information and just have a more complete processing at the gut level, as opposed to just this barrier of just how excited you are, because I think we don't realize it, but along with the excitement, along with the enthusiasm, there maybe also be some viciousness that forms those barriers. Okay. And I think we just need to be honest about that. And then if we do have a place where we have trouble taking in information because we're forming like a silent psychic violence, like as part of, like, say, maybe as part of the rejection mechanism. You know how when a person can reject an organ, like if you get an organ transplant, but your body flips out and just rejects the organ, maybe at a metabolic biological level, your body is sort of like all the alarms are the alarms are like, hey, this is an intruding presence. This organ is actually like an enemy. It's kind of like the way your body identifies like viruses or bacteria. And basically it just triggers all these like alarm reactions where it's like your body actually goes into like a rage, like into a war. And at the biological level, your body's like at warfare against this stuff, and there's like a rejection. Likewise, I think with narcissism, when we have content that is like contradictory to our preferred beliefs, or when we have considerations that frustrate, let's say, like, say, if I'm attracted to someone, it's frustrating for me to consider like other peripheral concerns, like, hey, maybe it's not the right time, or maybe I don't need to be hitting on people, or maybe, you can't always talk to someone just because you're attracted to them, and just all these other considerations. They're sort of like distracting frustrations. And maybe in a sense, biologically, I sort of like put like a rejection, kind of like you would reject an organ, at your basic biological level. Like, I want to reject anything that's sort of like that would frustrate my focus on what I think I'm attracted to or what I think I'm excited by. You know what I mean? So basically, there may be a lot of like deep metabolic sort of levels of sort of antagonism, warfare, rage, violence that sort of are in that rejection. You know what I mean? And it's all part of the combined psychic content that puts up a wall. And we think we're just being excited. We think we're just being upset. Like, oh, that's just upsetting to me, you know. But in reality, there may be a lot of other metabolic processes that are putting like a lot of violence, kind of like the equivalent to rejecting an organ or the way your body reacts to, like, say, a bacteria or a virus. There may be a lot of arousal in the whole body and the whole metabolism that actually does have the content of like hostility, rage, violence, you know what I mean, on some deep level, you know. And so basically, how do we deal with that? You know, I think probably the best thing to do is first admit it and explore it, you know, and understand that it's not going to go away like quickly. Okay. It may take a lot of work, and it may never go away, but at least we can adopt, like, say, maybe tools around it, you know, so that we can be aware of it and understand that our sobriety is compromised when we get in really aroused or enthusiastic states. And just because we feel just enthusiastic or excited, we're not aware that there's some viciousness that comes in also to set up barriers to prevent, let's say, conflicting information from coming in. Okay. So we just need to be mindful that there may be more in the package of a barrier than what we think is just, like, say, getting excited. You know what I mean? And just be mindful of that and understand, you know, that it's not just going to go away. Okay. But to maybe be patient and maybe not take action when we're excited. You know, just learn as a habit, as a fundamental belief, that it's just not a good idea when you're upset, when you're excited, to, like, say, take any action. Now, in the case of me, let's say, trying to suffer, let's say, the pain of, like, say, losing a career and how much that hurts. Okay. At some point, I'm going to have to say, okay, right now I'm too excited about that. I'm too upset about it. All right. But just understand not to mistake that upsetness is actually processing. Okay. I'm not really processing it. Okay. I'm really putting up a barrier. So I have to be mindful that over time, if I can catch myself on a different day when it doesn't hurt so much, you know, to just try to take in the basic overall reality and try to process it. Maybe, like, say, today, if I'm feeling particularly upset as I recall, let's say, my past, and I think of how, you know, I wasn't able to be a pilot and how it really reflected on, I was a person with problems and, you know, really kind of hurt my ego or whatever. Maybe today is not the day to process that, because right now I'm just putting up a lot of barriers to that. And just to understand that that's not a real emotion. It's not a processing emotion. It's just a barrier emotion. And just to understand that maybe on another day when it's a little calmer, when it's a little less, more subsided, you know, maybe to kind of just have some reflection, just so I can sort of digest that stuff that's hard to digest. You know what I mean? Likewise, if I'm really excited, let's say I'm not today, I don't have that problem today, but when I was younger, let's say if I was really attracted by a girl, hey, okay, I'm excited, but you know what? I'm going to put that on the shelf. Today I'm too excited. In a couple of days, I'll think about it and reflect on it. And I'll reflect on it and reflect also on the fact that I myself am an immature person, that maybe it's not wise for me to be dating just anybody, you know, that maybe I need to be careful about whether I should even be dating right now. And I have other considerations. Maybe I have other goals in life. Like when I was in college, you know, maybe I just need to focus on getting good grades and maybe having a part-time job. And, you know, yeah, you can be attracted to somebody, but you could let a few days go by, and when it calms down, it's not so intense, just kind of put it in the whole mix of other factors. Like, yeah, it's frustrating, but, you know, I have other things going on in my life. And also, you know, a man cannot always go after whatever he's attracted to. And sometimes you just have to, you know, let things be and be uncomfortable, whatever. And just maybe catch yourself on another day when it's not so intense, so that you can just sort of have that reflection to really try to get some gut level processing, because that's the real emotion. Okay. Just being excited about somebody, if it's all part of a barrier, if it's just barrier emotions, we just have to be mindful and wise that that's not real processing. That is emotional, but it's not processing. It's not gut level processing. And there's nothing towards integration in those states. And in fact, if all we experience are just barrier emotions, we're actually just going to be a fragmented personality, and we're not going to have very much integration. So almost as a habit, you know, we ought to notice, all of us, even those of us who don't have narcissism, you know, when we do, all of us have, let's say, the occasional barrier emotions. Okay. The emotions that are so intense that it doesn't really allow a comprehensive gut level processing of our basic environmental circumstance. Okay, when we have that barrier situation, just to let it be, not to take any action, to be really careful not to take action at that time, not to make any big decisions, and to make sure to check in with ourselves later when the things kind of subside a little bit. Okay, and then recheck in when we're not so aroused by that stuff. Okay, and just recheck in when we're in a calmer state and see if we can get some gut level processing, because it's important for people to have reflection, to reflect on our circumstances and let ourselves process things. Okay, imagine if one of my parents dies, there's going to be a period where I can't really process it. I'm just going to feel the pain of it. But I should not mistake that pain for true grieving, okay? Because the true grieving will be later on as I sort of take stock of the situation and sort of let it metabolize and process in my gut level, okay? So the initial pain of losing somebody, I guess you could call that, like, say, the first stage of grief, but it's not really the meaningful stage of grief. That's just the pain, and it is kind of a barrier state. And so I think, especially those of us who have cluster B, if we ever do have a tragedy in our life, if somebody does die around us, or if there is, or let's say if we lose a career, or whatever, we need to be mindful that just the pain, just the initial pain, that is not the processing. That's just a barrier. And that we always need to make sure to have the habit of rechecking in with unpleasant things, catch ourselves when we're not so excited about it, and see if maybe once in a while we can sort of get a little gut level processing, get some perspective, because that's where we're going to develop our integration. And we're going to start developing, like, say, other muscles and other conditioning, psychological conditioning, because a lot of us are just conditioned just to the barrier states. And unfortunately, the barrier states have I believe, a lot of rage and violence in them. Okay. And so if we don't have other types of processing, if we don't create the habit of having a more gut level processing at times, let's say when we're not so excited, okay, we may just get into the habit where the only emotions we know how to have are the barrier emotions. Okay. The fireworks emotions, everything fireworks, everything intense, and with a lot of violence and rage. And that can be a problem. Okay. The other problem too with a lot of narcissistic people is that their overall demeanor is very calm. Okay. But the barriers, okay, are these little places where their rage and their viciousness actually sets up sort of, like, say, in the structure of what they do allow in and what they don't allow in. Okay. So the demeanor may be calm, but it's deceptive because the actual architecture of the personality is built with rage. Okay, so it's kind of a paradoxical thing where you can come across as very calm because your demeanor is calm. Okay, but the actual structure of how you limit things and how you confine things and how you select information and put barriers on things, the actual architecture of the barriers actually has your violence and your rage. Okay, so I think for a lot of people who are severely narcissistic, okay, it's going to be very hard to convince them that they have rage inside of them because they're not going to feel it. It's sort of built into the structure of their, let's say, the architecture of their personality, and they themselves feel perfectly calm. Okay, so I don't have an answer for that. I think it would take a very talented, very, very talented sponsor or a very talented therapist to sort of help a person see what they cannot even feel in themselves. Okay, because it's so dissociated. You know what I mean? So basically, I want to have optimism that we can work on these barriers. Okay, and that we can sort of dissolve these barriers and sort of improve ourselves as people. But I want to sort of condition that optimism with a very realistic attitude that it may be extremely difficult. It may take a lot of very, very slow development, and maybe in some cases a very talented mentor, sponsor, or a therapist to actually help a person even begin to see what's really going on inside themselves. Okay. Because I think a lot of people, they live sort of in the barrier state and they don't even know what it's like to get to the processing state, just because the barrier state calls so much attention and it takes up so much psychic energy. So, anyway, I just leave you guys with this idea. Anybody who's struggling with cluster B issues or interested in cluster B issues, that I think is it's worth considering, just really distinguishing between barrier emotions and processing emotions. Okay. So anyway, really appreciate you guys being patient with me, and thanks for watching.